So, next up. On or about December the 18th, 1883, it was seen in the drawing room by my brother and another little boy. They were playing outside on the terrace, and when they looked through the window and ran in to see what it could be, they ran in to see who it could be who was crying so bitterly. They found no one in the drawing room, and the parlourmaid told them no one had come into the house. After the first time, she originally sees the figure herself at the top of the stairs. I followed the figure several times downstairs into the drawing room, where she would remain at the right-hand side of the bow window. Now, this is the front of the house behind me, so it's the back of that, the opposite side to that. I'll show you in a moment. The first time I spoke to her was on the 29th of January 1884. I opened the drawing room softly and went in, standing just by it. She came in and walked past me to the sofa and stood still there, so I went up to her and asked if I could help her. She moved, and I thought she was going to speak, but she only gave a slight gasp and moved towards the door. Just by the door I spoke to her again, but she seemed quite unable to speak. She walked into the hall, and then by the side door she seemed to disappear as before. So, Victorian Cheltenham, and of course this being Rosina, she tries experiments. She puts strings with marine glue on either side across the stairs at different heights from the ground, and then when she follows the ghost passes straight through them. She also keeps trying to touch the ghost, but the ghost always seems to avoid her, melting away like a dream. However, many of them see it, all at the same time, and in the end over 50 people saw this mysterious woman in black. This is one of my favourites. July the 21st, I went into the drawing room where my father and sisters were sitting about 9 in the evening and sat down on a couch close to the bow window. A few minutes later, as I sat reading, I saw the figure come in at the open door, cross the room and take up a position behind the couch where I was. I was astonished no one in the room saw her, as she was so distinct to me. My youngest brother had seen her before, was not in the room. She stood behind the couch for half an hour, and then as usual walked to the door. What kind of a woman is this? She's got a ghost standing behind her sisters for 30 minutes. Does she scream? Does she faint? Does she yell? She just sits there and watches and waits what's going to happen. Anyway, I went after her on the excuse of getting a book and saw her pass along the hall until she came to the garden door where she disappeared. I spoke to her as she passed the foot of the stairs, but she did not speak, though she stopped and paused as if she was about to speak. Anyway, there's so many more. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and over a period of several years, there are more and more sightings, including ones at the front of the house, ones in the gardens behind towards the orchard. For example, August the 12th, while coming up across the garden, I walked towards the orchard where I saw the figure cross the orchard, go along the carriage drive in front of the house, in at the open side door, and across the hall and into the drawing room, I following. I crossed the drawing room and took up my usual position behind the couch. I could not. My father came in and I told him she was there. He couldn't see the figure but went up to where I showed him she was. She then went swiftly round behind him, across the room, out of the door, across the hall, disappearing as usual near the garden door. And then there's another occasion, famously, that's reported by our later correspondent, where a group of children see her in the back garden, so they play Ring a Ring of Roses round her, and she walks towards them and just passes somehow between them, despite the fact their hands are linked. Anyway, for most of 1883 to 1885, she's seen regularly. In 1886, the sightings begin to die down, and by 1894, she's seen quite little. Okay, what I'm going to do now is... where's it gone? Oh. Where on earth have I put my share screen? There we go. So let's tell the story very quickly in about 10 slides if I can. Can you all see that? Loz, can you see that?
Yeah, all good, CJ.
So, St Anne's House, Pittville Circus. This is from the back. This is the window where she tends to stand. It's a substantially sized house. I can give you the estate agent's details from 1865, which are quite fun to read, but I won't because it will take too long. But she appears as a woman in the fashions of the 1860s, similar to this. The only thing that's wrong with the picture, with this mock-up here, which was done by John Madden. He's a clever lad. Sexy John, we call him. But he's a great guy. He used to be part of the Student Parapsychology Society with me. It should have a black handkerchief clutched to the face. She was always seen with a black handkerchief clutched to her face as if bitterly crying. Right, okay, not snobby enough. So, let's start the story. In the 1850s, Cheltenham had a reputation for being posh, as in port out, starboard home, posh with a capital P. And at that time, the British East India Company was ruling large parts of India essentially as a private empire, but beholden to the British Empire. And large numbers of people who had gone out to India and spent their whole life ordering people around in the Raj came home, and when they retired, they would move to Cheltenham Spa. Cheltenham had been very fashionable in the 1780s because of, 1750s onwards, because of the Spa, and through the period of Jane Austen, and Mad King George came here to take the waters. And the best fact about Cheltenham waters, apart from the famous tomb I always mention, a tomb in Harrogate Churchyard, "Here I lie with my 4 daughters killed by drinking Cheltenham waters," is that their actual effects were very powerful. Yep, the waters that you sampled and you drank at the well before you danced in your ball gown, their major effect was they were a potent laxative. So they purged you, and for the next few hours you would be vigorously expelling wastes. I think nowadays they use colonic irrigation for the same thing. So next time you watch Pride and Prejudice or a Regency era thing, you can think of the fact that there was a vast meadow of public toilets directly opposite Pitville pump rooms with attendants waiting with towels because of the unpleasant side effects, or in fact intentional effects, of Cheltenham waters. Now, Cheltenham was snobby, but it wasn't snobby enough for some people. And Pitt, who's a brother of the famous Pitt the Younger, decides to buy or to develop a piece of land on the side of his Pittville estate. And he's got a mansion there, but he decides that what he'll do is he'll make what's essentially a gated community. And I thought it was the first one in England, but I was wrong. There's an earlier one up on Battledown, above Cheltenham, and that's still there today. It's got walls round it, it's got electric gates, and if you go through, if a tradesman drives up, they have to open the gates, and somebody says, "Oh, it's for number such and such," and they buzz to check, and you might be admitted. But for some reason, when I cycle through, they come out and ask me in for coffee, or Witcher, that happened to me once, a woman asked me in for coffee, and on another occasion a lady came out and gave me and Paul some apples, and they just seem to, I don't know, maybe I just look mad or something, but they never trouble me. But anyway, these gated communities are the last outrage really of the wealthy, aren't they? And in Cheltenham they built a whole new second town, that's what they described it as, called Pittville. And to build a house there you had to get through the Morals Commission, you had to be the right kind of person, and servants, they have big wide avenues with beautiful frontages, and if you want to understand the meaning of the word facade, come to Cheltenham, because the back of the houses are horrible. They're just red brick and falling down often, and along behind the houses are these narrow little lanes where the servants walk. Anyway, I've told you all this before, I'm sure. So there's Pittville Pump Room, and this is the gates of Pittville. And it actually failed because the local conservative evangelical hellfire preacher, Francis Close, who was as unpleasant a fellow as you could ever hope to meet, decided that he was a conservative and Pittville was a Whig. So what he did was he bought a swampy area called the Marsh, which is now called St Paul's, just to the left, drained it, and built cottages for navvies and railway workers and Irish immigrants and people from Birmingham, and moved them in deliberately, essentially to lower the property prices of his neighbours and really offend them. So that's why in Cheltenham today you go from these magnificent houses to grotty little terraces right next to them. Guess which one I live in. So this is St Anne's, this is the house, and according to most records it was built in 1860, except that's wrong, it was actually built in 1865, well, like 1864. That's where it stands today. There's a fantastic story. The Cheltenham's driving centre is at the far end of this road, and there was a driving instructor who was taking up someone, and they both probably knew the story. And as they drove down the road and they were coming up the other way, suddenly a black figure glided out in front of them, holding a handkerchief to her face. It was the ghost of Imogen Swinhoe, clad all in black. And unsurprisingly, the woman swerved and went into the back of a van, which turned out to be an outside broadcast van because they were filming a reconstruction of the ghost for a show called Strange But True with Michael Aspel. My source for that is Bob Meredith, who's a local school teacher who collected ghost stories, but I think that's a nice story. So it wasn't a real ghost on that occasion. Right, where am I going? So this is All Saints Church. Students of mine will probably remember it because I quite often take you there, because in the 1950s, when the Gorbals was full of children running around hunting for vampires, there was a vampire scare down here, and it's got some creepy old statues around it. So at night I take the students down and I tell them the story of the 1950s vampire legend, that it was haunted by a vampire, and I send them walking around with a candle between each of them, holding hands in the dark. And it's just a bit of a rite of passage. And one year, we came out the other side, and the first two girls came out, and suddenly one of them screamed and fainted, I think, because all of the others panicked, because the girl who'd come out first had blood trickling down her neck. And all it was she'd had a spot that she'd scratched, but the others were convinced she'd been bitten by the vampire. A strange story, actually. Years and years and years ago, the Arnolds are like this one. There's a room around the back, and it was open one day. I was cutting back, I lived in Hewlett Road, and as I was cutting back, I went in, and all over the table were documents with titles like Psychic Vampirism, a Study, Psychical Studies, Exorcism and Deliverance. And what I didn't know was at the time was Canon Michael Higgs, I think it was, had been talking on behalf of the Church Fellowship of Psychical and Spiritual Studies, and was talking later that evening. So I had in fact not found a nest of vampires, I just stumbled into a psychical research group that I'd never heard of, which is quite unlikely, but I managed to do it. So I was quite creeped out for about a couple of days till somebody explained to me what it was. Okay, this is the front of St Anne's, the building. Don't go there. It's private flats now, and you will get your head kicked in. No, not necessarily, but you know, if you don't know anybody who lives there, then they will likely call the police on you, and quite rightly so. North Hall next door is quite important because in the 1960s or 70s, Reader's Digest came out with a book called Strange Stories and Amazing Tales, and I don't know if any of you have ever read that, but there's an article in there called The Ghost That Moved House, about the lady in black, and it's because she was also seen at various points here and in the 50s across the road in a house on the other side. This little apartment block on the left is exactly where the old stable block and servants' quarters were. And it's really bizarre because for most of history, after it was demolished in the 1880s, I think, there was no building there. And then about 15-20 years ago, they rebuilt a building and the exact floor print, it's like the ghost of a building has come back to life. I guess it's just because they had the foundations, or there might have been existing planning permission or something, but there you go. So lots and lots and lots of boring photos of a house, and I think I'm going backwards. That might explain why they seem so similar. So why am I so fascinated by this place, apart from the fact that you can go and walk around it, that the ghost tends to appear in midsummer and during the day, and it's one of those hauntings that, according to Fowlus, who was a president of the SPR, is the best attested haunting in the annals of psychical research. It's a very famous haunting. Well, oh, that's Holy Trinity. I haven't got a good photo. Okay, I'll stop there. So, I'll show you some of the others in a moment. The story of the house might not seem very promising, and I'm afraid I haven't done much justice to the ghost story. But I was fascinated by it by the late 80s, and in the early 90s, myself and John Mackenzie, who was a trainee maths teacher, used to drink together at the pub. And one night we were up at a pub called the Norwood, and I told a whole bunch of young nursing students the story of the Cheltenham ghost. And John said, "That's so eerie. We should go there, Chris. But I can't tonight because I've got to teach tomorrow." And I said, "Okay, I'll take them down there." So all of these young nurses followed me down, and we walked down till we got to Pitmill Circus roundabout, which is just a great big roundabout with a green park in the middle with benches and a few trees. And as we walked across, a mysterious figure came out from under the tree, and she glided before us. And all 20 of the nurses wrote reports in a big black notebook I had. And one of them said, "It was a profound, life-changing moment. I know I'll never be the same again." Another said she felt a deep sense of melancholy of her. And several, 2 or 3, smelt her odd, old-fashioned perfume. And they talked about the veil, they talked about the handkerchief that was held to her face, they talked about the ornate widow's dress. Which was bloody surprising considering it was John Mackenzie wearing an orange wool blanket over his head. As we left the pub, he had run home, grabbed the orange old school, his old college blanket off his bed, which is just an ordinary orange blanket, chucked it over his head and hidden in the tree and waited for us. And I saw a 40-year-old maths teacher with sneakers sticking out of the bottom of the blanket, but they all saw exactly what I'd been talking about. So it's quite an interesting experiment, and one that at the time I did write up, though I've never published it. Shame though, because it was a good story. So, can we explain the Cheltenham ghost? There have been hundreds of attempts to explain this one over the years, and there are a number of very famous theories. I'm not going to, because I haven't got my notes, I'm not going to try and go back and read you a bit. But one of the most interesting ones to me is the bit where the captain disbarred. His wife was a great invalid. She was trapped in an upstairs room. She wasn't able to come downstairs. And the family were always kept quiet and moved around her. And remember the occasion when the father, Captain Disbarred, is led into the dining room and the ghost is there standing in front of him? But he can't see it. That's a bit odd, isn't it? Well, maybe not. Not if it's a spiritual vision or a hallucination. Or what if he could see it, but was pretending not to? Because the way it's phrased, that struck me as entirely possible. Now, 50 people saw this woman walking around, but what else does she do that's really unusual? She clutches a handkerchief to her face. Now, that could be because she's crying her eyes out, or it could be because she doesn't want to be recognised. So, an attractive young woman in black, who's a ghost, who can be heard. She's normally seen padding down the stairs late at night from the upstory past the younger daughter's bedroom door and going and leaving the house quietly. She always wears soft shoes. Is it a ghost? Or is it a mistress? Peter Underwood was convinced that the Cheltenham ghost was in fact a mistress, and that the accounts by Rosina, by the time she'd actually got to know more about it, the reason her and some of the other members of the family didn't really want to discuss it anymore wasn't because they'd become embarrassed socially by it or anything like that. The reason was it was their father's mistress, and they'd finally realised that that's all it was, and that she was a woman who came into the house clutching a handkerchief to her face. I'm not entirely convinced, but there's another aspect about it which I find interesting. Whenever she goes to talk to the ghost pauses and turns to look at her. Now, this is the snobbiest place, the poshest, most snobby, most puritanical place in Victorian England. If there's anywhere that getting away with a mistress might involve creating a ridiculous ghost story, this is the place to do it. But there's a problem with this theory. The problem is a woman called Imogen Swinhoe. And this is going to take us back from the 1880s to the very first, to when the house was first built. And this is the story I'm actually planning to tell tonight. I'm then going to tell another little ghost story, but we'll have a break in the middle just so that, because I know a lot of people are going to have to go. How are we doing for time, Loz?
7:30.
Thank you, I'll get moving then. Okay, so let's have a quick look at my notes. I think I've already stated it's not a good idea to go to the house, for obvious reasons. Okay, we don't need to know about the details of the house because you can see pictures of it. Let's begin with the first inhabitant of the house, Henry Swinhoe. Henry Swinhoe was born about 1829 and he grew up in Garden Reach in Calcutta, and when he bought the house the first thing he did was name it Garden Reach. And the Swinhoes were a prosperous British family. One of them, General Swinhoe, commanded the 76th Native Infantry, who wore beautiful, beautiful orange costumes, and they were part of the army of the East India Company. And for those who don't know the story, the East India Company was divided into 6 sections, I believe, and Bengal was one of them. and they had their own private armies, and they basically developed the economy for the benefit of all, and brought enlightenment. No, they were completely murderous bastards, I expect. But anyway, enough of that. Whatever the truth, the Honourable East India Company ruled India on our behalf, and Calcutta was their Bengali strong point. And there's a very, very fashionable district there where a deposed prince had built a palace down by the river, the Hooghly River, or however you say it, and that's called Garden Reach, and that's where the Swinhoes lived, and that's where many of them are buried. And when he was 12 years old, Henry applied to become a cadet, essentially to go to school and to train in the military, and he joined the East India Company's army. And he eventually became a lieutenant. Sorry, I've got to turn that off. He became a lieutenant in the army, and in the year 1849, when he would have been about 20, he became involved in a rather unpleasant incident. The Sikhs at the time had a ruler called Duleep Singh, or Singh, we'll say Singh, it's easier. And Duleep Singh, who eventually moved to England and became a favourite of Queen Victoria, was deposed by the British. And after they deposed him from his kingdom, so they could administer it, more justly in their own interest, the Sikhs rose, and there was a second Anglo-Sikh war. And the first major engagement was the Battle of Chilianwala, where the British were absolutely shot to bits. And to be fair, they inflicted almost as many casualties on the Sikhs, but the thing which really annoyed many of those who fought was that the correspondents from the Times, etc., spoke endlessly and effusively of the bravery, the nobility, the ferocity, and the fighting prowess of the Sikh soldiers, and said how they were all heroes. But they weren't quite so kind about the East India Company, the British troops. So it just goes to show that propaganda wasn't very well developed at that time, was it? The Sikhs were apparently great, and according to the journalists. And one of those who probably had more reason than others to resent that praise was young Henry Swinhoe, who was badly injured in the fighting. And as a result, he left the army. And in 1851, 2 years after his brush with death, we find him in the Bombay Times and Journal of the 21st of February 1851. Yes, I have been reading a lot of Indian newspapers from this period. On Thursday the 6th of February at St Paul's Cathedral, he was married by the Reverend A. Garstin, Henry Swinhoe, Esquire, solicitor to Elizabeth Frances, widow of the late G. Higgins. So I looked it up, and it turns out that G. Higgins, who has just turned 19, had been married when she was 16 or 17 to George Edmund Higgins, a young man. They married on George the 12th, and on March the 16th, the 26-year-old George had dropped dead. I've not been able to establish a cause, but I suspect cholera. So the honeymoon was cut somewhat short by his unexpected death. And 2 years later, Elizabeth Frances heard, as she'd originally been, her father being dead, her husband now being dead, married Henry Swinhoe. And I thought, what a noble and generous chap. He married that poor widow. More of that later. Anyway, Henry and Elizabeth might have stayed happily in Calcutta, or Kolkata as it is now, but in 1857 there was a rising, the Indian Mutiny. And at that point, a lot of people decided that they did not want to be in India anymore and came back to England. And amongst them were the Swinhoes. And in 1858, at All Hallows on the Wall, which is a church in London, we find the baptism of their first child, who went on to grow up and marry a Kansas farmer's daughter and move to America, but that's another story. Anyway, so the Swinhoes move over from Calcutta and try and find somewhere suitably posh to live. And eventually, they spend a bit of time down on the south coast. And in 1865, I'll skip all they're down in Sidmouth at Devon. They eventually turn up in Cheltenham, where a brand new house has just been completed here, Garden Reach, as they call it. So they move into their wonderful house. And the Cheltenham Looker-On says that they'd recently taken up residence because I found an incredibly complicated and tedious correspondence about water rates and creating a water company, and how pumping water to houses in Cheltenham would cause everybody who was anybody to leave, because who want piped water to their house? It was the end of civilization. And one bloke who was arguing against it wrote back and said, of course it's not the end of civilization. People will still buy houses. Since March, the following 17 houses have been bought, and these are the people who live in them. So that's how I was able to find out when he moved in. Anyway, his brother turns up, Charles Swinhoe of His Majesty's 40th Regiment. His own regiment, the 30th, no longer exists because it mutinied and they tried to shoot their officers, who managed to escape over the walls at night, unlike many of them. And the Swinhoes are a large family. Henry's wife, Elizabeth Frances, has children who are Henry George Swinhoe, aged 8, Frances Swinhoe, a daughter, aged 6, Charlotte Elizabeth Swinhoe, a daughter, aged 5, the Great Beauty, Alice Swinhoe, a daughter, aged 4, and Rodway Charles John Swinhoe, a son who was aged 3. Those are the ages at the time of her death. When she died, aged 35, she'd had a child every year, apart from one, for the last sort of 8 years or so, 7 years or so. So I don't think it's entirely unsurprising that the poor lady succumbed. And she died on the 11th of August, 1866, aged just 35. So, is she the ghost of St Anne's? Well, probably not. Reasons being that she may have possibly had some Indian heritage. She certainly would have been straight back from India. She was healthy, she had lots of children, and the ghost of St Anne's appears in widow's weeds, that is to say, mourning dress. And there's absolutely no chance whatsoever that this woman would have been a widow, because her husband survives her by many years. So, Elizabeth dies, and I'll ignore my notes because this will take too long. Henry decides to sell up the house and move, and he puts it on the market, which is why I've got the estate agent's details, which tell me the layout of the rooms and how big they all were, and all those other tedious facts that psychical researchers are obsessed with. But for the sake of the story, I'll skip over all that stuff. And let's just say that he eventually meets another woman. And this new woman is called Imogen Hutchins. Now, all the sources say that she lived in Bristol, but she didn't. She lived round the corner, what's now North Place Car Park, down by the Cotswold pub, for anyone who knows Cheltenham. And she lived there with her mum. Her sister had moved to Bristol, where she'd married the Deputy Lieutenant Governor of Pembrokeshire. And they had 3 children. Her sister had already had, by this point, 3 children who went on to all be rugby stars and live in Clifton. But poor Imogen had got to the age of, I think it's 35, without marrying. And she is considered to be a spinster, much given to playing cards and drinking the occasional gin. Pleasant, pious, and somewhat dull, from what I can make out from the gossip of the time. Imogen is courted by Henry Swinhoe, the dashing former military officer, or NP, non-commissioned officer, NCO, former NCO, in fact he might have been, no, he would have been an officer, yeah, former officer, now turned solicitor, who's got this big house and a ready-made family. And they get married, and the vicars of Holy Trinity and St Mary's do a joint ceremony, and anyone who's anyone in Cheltenham society comes along, and it's a big society wedding, and most people think it was meant to be. Why? Well, Henry had served, as you remember, at the battle where he was wounded in the 30th Regiment, the 30th Native Infantry of Bengal, in their bright orange uniforms. Must have made them perfect targets for sharpshooters. And the commander of his unit was a Major Hutchins, who just happened to be the father of Imogen. So it's entirely possible that when they were both in India and they were both young, Imogen and Henry had a pre-existing relationship. And they find themselves, him widowed, she living round the corner with her mum after her father's death. They get together. And they live happily. No, they don't. The story turns into hell. According to some people, gossip, Imogen was severe with the children and beat them. What everybody agreed on was that alcoholism was rife in the household and that they used to throw things at one another and at the servants. This, however, was gossip, and when the Society for Psychical Research were recounting the events later, they tended to play down the level of chaos that existed. During this time, Swinhoe also starts to run into financial problems. They've been able to trace through various sources, his monetary situation. And at this point, he suddenly comes into a brilliant, clever idea, which is, this is really complicated, but basically, so I'll summarise it in a couple of lines. His first wife had been left an inheritance by her husband in a prenuptial agreement. Remember George Edmund? When George Edmund dropped dead 2 months later, he left his estate to be brought and given to his wife in annual payments. Her father honoured that, and when he died, the money went to his daughter, the sister, who still honoured it, but when she died, the money dried up, and there's a large sum of rupees that were owed to Elizabeth Swinhoe. Now, the argument was whether when she died, that interest then passed to her husband. And so it went to court, and it went through 1866 to 1869, 3 years of increasingly escalating legal battles, till it ends up at the Court of Chancery, where the case is known as Gristle versus Hurd 1869. And in the end, Henry Swinhoe wins, and he gets his wife's money back and gets control of it. I don't think anyone's ever mentioned that before, probably because it's got nothing to do with the ghost, but I thought it was interesting, so there you go. Now, at this time, within a year of the marriage, things have hit a problem. On the 17th of June 1871, after a year of marriage, Henry Swinhoe draws up a deed of separation and has Imogen escorted to her parents, to her mother's home. The reason being her gross and continual habit of drunkenness. The fact she used violent and indecent language against Henry in front of the children, and the fact that she, on occasions, became so drunkenly violent that she terrified him by the sound of things. He claims his health had broken under her rages, and he kicked her out. That was the 17th of June. On August the 15th, 1871, he ripped up the deed of separation, and the happy couple reconciled, and she moved back into Garden Reach. Now, in 1876, things went really wrong, and the couple sued for divorce. And divorce was not something you did lightly at this time. And I was able to get the divorce papers, which had been sealed for over a century. And it seems, I mean, obviously Myers had no way, when the SPR carried out their investigation into the Cheltenham ghost, they had no way of knowing any of this. But Imogen makes her way to Bristol, and on March 1875, Henry publishes this in the Cheltenham Mercury, 27th of March 1875, in the Cheltenham Mercury. I, Henry Swinhoe, of Garden Reach, Pitfield, Cheltenham, will not be held responsible for any debts or debt that Mrs. Imogen or Henry Swinhoe may contract in her or my name, nor will I pay any debt or debts that may have been contracted by Mrs. Swinhoe, and for which I am not legally responsible. Garden Reach, Cheltenham, 25th March 1875. Now, he's still married to her at this point, but when you're posting public notices like that, the marriage is probably in a future. I don't know. Anyone who's married want to try it? Anyway, we'll see. On the 15th of May, he files a petition for divorce. He describes her as a violent drunk who used intemperate, indecent and vulgar language in front of the children and the servants, and hurled furniture at her husband. On the 22nd of December 1874, she threw a chair at him and then assaulted him, striking him repeatedly. I shouldn't laugh because domestic violence really isn't funny, but it is. You know, it's not the kind of image of the Victorian lawyer and patriarch you get, is it? One who's being beaten up by his wife on a regular basis. It's horrendous. It's horrific. On April the 2nd, 1875, Imogen attacked Henry with a broom. He was only saved by the quick intervention of Celia Dolphin, the cook, who took the broom off her and managed to bustle him out of the room. On or about April the 5th, 1875, Imogen gathers the household and accuses Henry of sleeping with Elizabeth Townsend, the housemaid, and having had an illegitimate child with her. Elizabeth Townsend breaks down and she claims that she caught them together in bed the day before, in front of the children and staff. She then assaults Henry, and Miss Townsend flees from the house, goes straight to the magistrates and brings a case for slander, which is settled out of court. But it does seem, by all of the papers that I could find, that she was probably completely innocent, the housemaid. Loz, how are we doing for time?
It's 7:45.
So, this is 1875. 7 years later, the famous Lady in Black appears, and at the time, they come up with a brilliant plan, which is they ask the family of the previous inhabitants of the house to show them photographs, and they mix up the sisters and various other women from the time, and all of the people who'd seen the ghost immediately pick out Imogen Swinhoe as being the ghost. So why did Imogen haunt? Well, at this point, Imogen buggers off back to Clifton, where she stays, and while she's down there, something really weird happens. And nobody's ever told this story before, and I think it tells us a lot about what was really going on. So I'm going to read it quite carefully. You're the first people to have heard it, actually, since the newspapers of the day, I think. Okay, Imogen left the house and went to Clifton, and Henry remained. On November the 5th, 1875, the first ghost at the house makes the papers. The incident made 2 days of the Cheltenham Examiner, November the 16th and 17th, in reporting from the Magistrates' Court under W. Skillycorn, Esquire. The case was brought by Charlotte Whittington, a servant to Garden Reach, against Frederick Crisp, an errand boy working for Mr. Taylor, a draper on the High Street. Mr. Stroud presented the case, Mr. Boodle the defence. The facts are generally agreed. On the night of November the 5th, the servants at Garden Reach had let off fireworks in honour of Guy Fawkes. It's quite a modern idea, isn't it? But no, apparently they were doing it back in the 1870s. At that time, the boy, and he's aged about 11, he's a young boy, he turns up at the main gate and rings a bell to be let in because he's delivering a parcel with silks or something in. And at this point, the cook, Mrs. Wilson, and Charlotte Whittington, the maid, make their way down to the gate. Now, at the front of the house, let's find a picture to show it, you can see there's quite a big hedge. And it seems that the hedge was just as big then, because apparently the gate, it was very dark around the gate. No, I don't think I've got one that shows the front. Oh, there you go. We can see the gate's just over to the left. But what happens is, as he comes in, the maid, Charlotte, takes the parcel off him and goes to walk into the house. And he's got a big heavy stick, like a walking stick, that the errand boys used to carry in case they were set about by wrong-uns. And he takes it and he smacks her over the head so hard that her hair is filled with blood. Blood's running down her face. And she turned around and apparently quite calmly said, "Why did you do that?" or something like that. "What are you doing?" And at that point, the boy hit her 3 or 4 more times just to make certain. So, concussed probably, with blood streaming down her face, she turns and she runs back into the house. At which point, the boy runs to the cook for safety and grabs the cook and hugs her and then runs home crying to his dad. So, what happened? Well, the fireworks had finished sometime between 9 and 10 and the boy got home sometime before 10. It's November the 5th, so it would have been pitch black. And as the boy came up to the house, he sees the 2 women approaching. They're both wearing white dresses and white masks held to their faces by elastic in the case of Charlotte. Charlotte also has net lace around her neck like a ruff that sticks out, and her face is powdered white, and in fact she was in what we would call fancy dress. The magistrates accused her of playing around foolishly by dressing as a ghost, as that's what she'd done. She'd been playing a ghost in the garden with the fireworks, as had the cook. They'd all dressed up as ghosts. And as a result, the woman in white was told if the boy had hit her over the head and run away, it was her own stupid fault, and the case was dismissed. Now, that actually might not seem much for muchness. I mean, there's quite a lot of detail about it. The poor boy was terrified by her masked and ghastly garb. It was her foolish behaviour that frightened the boy so badly his health was affected and he was in danger of losing his job as he would no longer go out after dark. The boy's father, Mr. Crisp, visited the house to apologise for his son's behaviour, and Mr. Swinhoe threatened him with a summons, swore at him, and threatened to shoot the boy if he ever came near the house again. The victim had, during her testimony in the trial, said, "There's no household better conducted than Garden Reach under Mr. Swinhoe." I have my doubts about this for reasons which will soon become clear. But what have we got here? Well, we've got a female apparition who wears all white. Now, the classic Cheltenham ghost that, of course, inspires local author Susan Hill, to write The Woman in Black, is the Woman in Black. That was what she was called throughout the Victorian era. But this is a woman in white. She's seen outside the house, though in the later haunting she's seen both outside and inside. But she's got a mask that covers her face and conceals her identity. The later ghost holds a handkerchief to her face. She's seen in the darkness but physical. So, is the woman in white in some way a precursor to the stories of the Woman in Black? Was it a local folk legend that arose from this case, and 7 years later when the children heard it, they got the facts wrong and started to imagine the ghost? A ghost that had in fact only been one of the family servants anyway. Or did they dress up as a ghost like that, wearing the mask, because there was already a ghost story there? But if so, why did they dress in white, not black? I don't know, but I found it fascinating. Who would expect the most famous house in Victorian England, haunted Victorian England, to have had a pre-existing ghost story? You know. Now, actually, that was the first thing, but then we get my favourite bit. While this is in court on November the 13th, there's another incident which occurs on Winchcombe Street in Cheltenham. And Winchcombe Street's a nice broad street that runs down to the High Street. And on either side there's cafes, and they filmed an episode of Sherlock there recently. They did a cafe scene there. But it can pass apparently for the nicer parts of the West End. But anyway, as you're going down, the pavements on the right-hand side are slightly narrower. So I'm going to guess that's where this occurred. So, Saturday, November the 20th, 1875... Henry Swinhoe ends up in front of the magistrate. It seems that on the 13th of November, Alice Speechy, a nursemaid, had taken out a young baby belonging to Mrs. Van Holst, who lived at the end of Winchcombe Street, for a walk. And as they're proceeding down the Winchcombe Street, they come across a group of 3 people. And Mrs. Van Holst quickly says, "Oh, be careful." Hang on, what does she say exactly? Let's get the words right, because I got them from the drawings. "Be careful. That is the man who hates prams. Go slow." It was too late. The nursemaid, Alice, said to the man, "Would you mind moving so I can get past?" "No, I won't. I'll overturn it first," he said. And with a curse, he placed his stick in the wheel of the pram and attempted to tip the baby into the road in the way of carriages. Now, I've told this story before, we all know this bit, but what a likeable fellow Henry Swinhoe was. You know, I was looking this up earlier, and there are people, the police have argued on occasion that you can arrest a woman for pushing a pram the wrong way up a one-way street. They did it to a drug dealer back in Bury in the 70s. It's a nice, well, should prams be on the pavement? Well, apparently, under certain reading of the law, no, they should be in the road, and that was the opinion Mr. Swinhoe took. He didn't believe that working class people should be allowed to walk on pavements. Oh no, not nursemaids. Anyway, he wasn't having it, was he? So what did he do? He tried to tip the baby in the road. Alice struggles to hold it to stop the baby being thrown out and possibly killed, sprains her wrist and starts to cry and scream, at which point Mrs. Van Holst threatens Swinhoe with the police for trying to kill her baby. He replied, "I don't care, tell who you like." He then presented, this is just such a black story, I can't help but laugh, he now presents a third story, a witness, a Mr. Carter. He said he was talking to Mr. and Mrs. Swinhoe, and the whole thing was a misunderstanding. That terrible nursemaid had come charging along and had tried to run down Mrs. Swinhoe with the pram. And it was clear that his wife was going to be injured, so he did what any husband would do, which is shove his stick in the wheel to stop the pram before his wife was hurt. That was all it came down to. he might have gotten away with that if it wasn't for the greengrocer across the road. And the greengrocer, whose name was Mr. Skinner, said, I saw the whole incident. He's guilty as sin. He deliberately tried to tip the baby into the road. He made the nursemaid cry. And what's more, he's always shouting at nursemaids with prams, and everybody in town knows that he hates prams. In fact, he's notorious for two things: getting pissed and attacking prams. And the fact that the prosecution started by saying, where's the actual phrase? Mr. Swinhoe is quite famous in Cheltenham, as much for his fondness for stimulants as his antipathy to perambulators, which is a slightly nicer way of saying it. Henry was fined £2, 6pence and 10 shillings. Apparently, he could have apologised to Mr. Van Holst for attacking his baby son Gustav. He chose not to. In fact, he threatened to shoot him. In fact, he threatened to shoot lots of people. Also, interestingly, on this particular occasion, he was drunkenly on the streets, but apparently amiably chatting to his wife, who was supposed to be living in Clifton. And once again, whenever they turn up, they're always together, and they appear to have been utterly toxic to one another. So, Henry Swinhoe, baby-bashing bastard, or hero of the Anglo-Sikh Wars, depends which way you want to look at him. But it's lucky he didn't actually tip that baby over, because of course the baby grew up to be Gustav Holst. And with it, if he had succeeded in killing the baby, we would not have the Planet Suite, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Holst went on to become one of England's most illustrious composers. He dropped the van, which was an affectation his father had adopted when he first emigrated to England. And Gustav Holst went on to live a long and content life. But he was almost killed by the husband of the woman in black, which is quite strange, isn't it? And that brings us back to Imogen Swinhoe. So, I was trying to work out why would she haunt the house. And then I discovered a really tiny bit in the SPR notes from the time where they said that after he died, because he dies shortly afterwards and she dies down in Clifton, and they're both taken and they're buried in Holy Trinity Church, which is just around the corner. And in fact, he's buried in the cemetery at St Mary's, and she's buried in Holy Trinity. And she's buried in a crypt underneath, which contains 300 coffins in racks, which are cemented in. And the bodies lie there to this day. We went there back in the early days of the CPRG to look. And she lies there with her mum and her dad, the major. But he and her were never to be reconciled, even in death. So it's a horrible, horrible story of Victorian tragedy and misery, and the children actually don't do that well out of it. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I was going through, and when they were talking about the reason for the haunting, it turns out that the people who take the house next, the Littlewoods, they're market gardeners from Sherdington. They're kind of respectable middle class, but they're not wealthy. And there's just the two of them, so a house like this seems like a massive extravagance. But they were happy there for the 6 months or so before the husband died. Almost everyone who moves into this house seemed to die, unfortunately. I suppose it was just Victorian mortality for you. They buried the body at the front. Sorry, the husband, when he moved out, his wife bought a house across the road and used to come and stand staring at the house. And she seems like a better possibility for the ghost, apart from the fact that she was alive and well and living as a neighbour at the time when the ghost was being seen, and so people would have recognised her straight away. But the reason they bought the house, according to friends of theirs, was that they had heard that the arguments between Henry and his wife, Imogen, had started out over his first wife, Elizabeth Frances Hurd's, jewels. Now, remember they were living in Anglo-India, and apparently she had some extremely beautiful jewellery, including diamonds, etc. And she was intent that that would form a dowry for her daughters and a fund for her children. And as it happens, Henry, who's constantly fighting lawsuits to try and win over what he thinks are his rights money-wise, seems to have honoured that. And after he remarries, he found Imogen on one occasion wearing his first wife's jewels and went ballistic at her and took them off her and hired a carpenter, and he built a hiding place under the morning room floor, a kind of concealed floor safe where she couldn't get to them, and had them stashed away. And when the Littlewoods buy the house and they get the carpenter to come back and take up the floorboard, the space is there but the jewels are gone. Now, it was only the last part of the clues there came together when I actually got the will and the settlement probate records. Because it turns out that Henry was basically bankrupt. And when he died, he owed a fortune, and many of the debts that he owed were on behalf of his ex-wife, Imogen. Imogen had run up massive bills for drink and also, well, for clothing and for various things. And so it looks likely that Henry was desperate for money. Imogen was living beyond their means. He was living beyond their means as well. They had this massive house with all these children. And they were at Cheltenham Boys' School. One of them was at a science academy. They were at Cheltenham Ladies. You know, they were around the best educational places, but they couldn't actually afford to pay the bills anymore. And when he died, it took 2 or 3 years for the house to be sold because it had developed a bad and unsavoury reputation, probably because of his tendency to come out. And the children were actually left in a very, very, very parlous situation, rescued by relatives. And eventually, the amount they got from the sale of the house was just less than his existing debt. But good news, because £500 worth, and this is £500 worth at the time, of jewellery was suddenly found that had belonged to his first wife. And those jewels were split between the children and were used to give them a start in life. Now, it would only have been about £100 each. But if we consider the £2, 6 shillings and 10pence, which is what Henry was charged for trying to murder baby Holst, Gustav Holst, is worth £155 in modern money, it would have been a few thousand. You know, it would have been enough to give them a chance. And I think, you know, it's hard to equate directly, and we don't know how they were distributed. But it would have been enough to provide a dowry, and the children actually went on to become solicitors, and they had first-rate educations, and their rich relatives, no doubt, stepped in to help them. But it is a truly, truly tragic story. And I wonder if we can find out anything more about those jewels and where the Heard family got them from. And the mystery there revolves around Charles Heard, the father of Elizabeth, before she married George Edmund, what was he called? Gristle. Yeah, George Edmund Gristle. The thing about the Grissells as well, George Edmund, her first husband, was, remember I said Henry was very kind to marry a young, beautiful widow and take her away from all that. It turns out he had left her an absolute fortune. So she, while he was married to her, despite the fact they only lived together, you know, they got married in January and he died in March, he'd made this prenup agreement which gave her wealth for life and would have kept Henry as a gentleman. So Henry guaranteed his future without work by marrying the widow, and when she died was left with her children and fighting a long and very expensive legal case to get his hands on the money, while for some reason hiding the only asset he had, gold and jewels, under the floorboards of the house. So why does Imogen haunt? That I can't say yet. That's as far as I've got so far. I think I've found more. If you look up the story of the Cheltenham Ghost, it will tell you all the appearances and it will tell you some of what I've just told you. But most of the background is missing. The Anglo-Indian side, the money side, the woman in white, that whole ridiculous situation on Bonfire Night and the mysteries around it. Anyway, I think I've talked long enough. What time is it now, Loz?
It's 8:05.
Bloody. Sorry, my apologies. I'm really sorry about that. I didn't realise I'd gone on so long. I won't talk the other one tonight. I'll do that another time when the speaker drops out at the last minute. So, thank you so much. I will stop sharing this. And I think everyone's probably left by now, haven't they? No?
No, you've still got 38 people.
Wow. Okay, are there any questions, or are people sick to death of this ghost story?
Well, I just wanted to add, CJ, apart from the fact that it was really interesting, I have heard you speak on this before, but not in such great detail. at last year's conference. But the last point that you made about the fact that that Henry married the widow, the rich widow, in order to get her money. It definitely wasn't uncommon for people to marry for convenience back in the Victorian period. And I think mental health issues were definitely prevalent because of that. Lots of people married people that they didn't love. Some people did marry for love, which, great for them. But back in the day, it wasn't
So actually,
all
here
that common.
I agree, but in this case, they were blissfully happy by all accounts. Elizabeth, his first wife, until she died from popping out a child every year for 7 years, was absolutely really in love with Henry.
I'm just talking about sort of the subsequent wife,
Generally, yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of, his infidelity, things like that, and his behavior as well, with the prams. That's a very unhappy person.
Or is it? I actually wonder because you see, he was madly in love with Elizabeth. She keeps having children, and unfortunately, then she dies in childbirth. And when she dies, he seems to become quite unhinged for a while. And it's at
Well,
that point that he starts drinking. And I'm wondering if the attack on prams is just because he finds babies
could
emotional.
well possibly be, yeah.
It's some kind of horrible trauma.
Mm,
And he was actually a nice bloke who just went through a shitty run of luck and then married a woman who was known to play cards and drink the odd gin and who turned out to be as drunk as he was.
yeah.
And there's no doubt that him and Imogen was a horribly tragic person. I mean, I'm sure she was a lovely, charming person in her own right, and her sister and her family, they did really well. As I said, they all played rugby.